Good morning, and thank you everyone for tuning in to a new edition of the Euro-Brazilian Democracy Forum. My name is Michael Westland, and I'm the organizer of the Democracy Forum on behalf of the German Embassy Brasilia. In this series, we aim to discuss those issues and challenges pertaining to democracy and the rule of law that affect us both in Brazil and in Europe. And nothing affects us more these days than the decline of democracies the world over. To be sure, nowadays democracies are mostly not brought down by coups any longer. Rather, their foundations and core tenets are being attacked little by little until what is left may be democratic by name only. What is the nature of this decline, and what can constitutional law do to stop and even prevent such processes? This we'll discuss in today's webinar, jointly organized by the German Embassy, Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and Jota Magazine. Both panelists today have each a background in Harvard and in Yale. Both are or have been constitutional court justices, and both are among the most eminent jurists of their respective countries, Professor Dieter Grimm and Minister Luís Roberto Barroso. The co-moderator today will be Sergio Fausto, Director of Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, to whom I'll give the floor now.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you. Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso has been holding webinars on law and politics, having the crisis of liberal democracy in the backdrop over the last 2 or 3 years, normally in partnership with Jota Magazine. So it's a real pleasure this time around to partner with the German embassy also, and to have 2 world-class guest speakers such as Professor Grimm and Ministro Barroso. So I hand it over back to you, Michael, or you please instruct me on how to proceed.
I think we'll now open the floor to Professor Dieter Grimm and ask him about his opinions on this important topic.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I would like to start by taking you 30 years back from now. It's to say the time around 1990. At that time, one could have the impression that constitutionalism as a model to legitimate and to regulate political power had established itself universally. Many states at that time turned away from authoritarian systems, dictatorial systems, racist systems, military regimes, and adopted new liberal democratic constitutions or revised their old constitutions. One could also observe a growing willingness to take constitutions more seriously than before, and to enforce constitutional law in case of non-compliance by politicians. Almost all of these countries had constitutions before, but they didn't matter much. They didn't matter much because the power holders claimed to know an absolute truth, or claimed to have superior insight into the common best of their countries. And they disregarded constitutional law in case of conflict between law and political interests. Now, judicial review was introduced. Constitutional courts were created in many of these countries, or general highest courts, apex courts, got the power of constitutional adjudication. Some of these newly established courts became themselves very powerful actors in their system. To name one in Europe, the Hungarian Constitutional Court, founded in 1990, was one of the most powerful courts for some time. In Africa, the South African Court, established after the end of the racist regimes, became one of the most powerful courts. In Asia, we perhaps may name Korea, and I think for Latin America, we certainly have to name the Brazilian Suprema Tribunal. Today, 30 years later, the constitutional world looks different. populist parties or populist movements have emerged, which defy more or less openly of constitutional democracy and undertake system transformations when they are successful and have won an election. There are a number of new democracies, but also for some older democracies, it is the case that we experience democratic backsliding. We saw something like that, something similar happening already in the first half of the 20th century. But there was a considerable difference between what is going on now. What we face today is not a wholesale rejection of democracy or an open revolution against the old system. Rather, what we see is a step-by-step transformation into more authoritarian systems in the name of democracy, even in the name of a veritable democracy as opposed against a degenerated democratic system. Populist movements or parties claim to represent the true will of the people or the will of the true people against corrupt elites who pursue only particular interests. And it helps that some traditional democracies are not delivering what is expected from a functioning state. This prepares the soil for populist and movements and political parties. Still, I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding about democracy on the side of populists. The promise of democracy, in my view, is not that the will of the people will prevail, because there is no such thing like the will of the people. There are only countless combinations of individual opinions and interests, out of which the collective will has to be formed always anew. It will never happen that all individuals or all groups find their opinions or their interests finally prevailing. The promise of democracy rather is that all may participate on an equal basis in the formation of the general will and can thus exercise influence on the outcome. Compromises, give and take, is inevitable in such a system, and it is not to be considered as an evil, it is a virtue. But even then, there will always be, in a democratic system, a majority and a minority. But here, I think, a very important element of liberal democracies intervenes, which is of crucial importance. The current majority does not have unlimited power to put its ideas and interests through. There are constitutional constraints that guarantee fundamental rights, and that guarantee in particular that the majority, the current majority, may not deprive the minority of the chances to become a majority in the next election or in the next vote. Majorities in a functioning liberal democracy are always temporary majorities, and they may not use their means of state to perpetuate their rule and to definitely exclude the others from participating in the democratic process. That has, of course, a number of preconditions that are usually guaranteed in a constitution. The most important one is, of course, fair elections. Equal chances for the competitors to convince the voters that their program and their personnel is the best. An open public discourse where criticism can be expressed and where different alternative ideas may be ventured. A free media system, whereby free means not only free from state control, but also means free from instrumentalization for economic interests. If one does not know in advance whether or not one will be in the majority, or in what subject matters one will be in the majority or in the minority, I think this should be an attractive system for everybody. But as we see, the system is losing support. So my question, for whom is it not so attractive? Firstly, certainly not for those who are convinced to possess an absolute truth or a superior insight in what is the best for the people. For those, the others who hold different ideas are not competitors, but are enemies. Secondly, for those who find themselves vis-à-vis a structural majority, so that they have no realistic chance to ever become a majority themselves. And then thirdly, perhaps those who face failure of a liberal democratic system, who see themselves vis-à-vis a system that performs badly with regard to the basic needs of a society who serve only a number of small elitist interests. Sorry. All this again prepares the soil for populism. At the bottom of the difference between representative democracy and the populist democracy is the understanding of the people. Populists start from the assumption that there is a homogeneous people with a pre-established common will. And this will finds expression either in a charismatic leader or in a populist program. Empirically, this cannot be verified. In a society, there are always different opinions and interests, and in times of growing individualism and in times of global mobility, more than ever. But viewed against the populist assumption of a pre-established will, those who have different opinions and voice different ideas are regarded as enemies. And vis-à-vis enemies, much more is allowed than would be allowed vis-à-vis competitors. Populists derive their assumption that there is a common will of the people and that they represent it, and they derive from this the right to abolish everything that is regarded as an obstacle to the implementation of the will of the people. So opposition is basically illegitimate. Activities of the opposition are hampered. Freedom of opinion is considered as the right to disseminate errors. Procedural requirements are regarded as pure formalism. Separation of powers is a device to obstruct the popular will. Institutes that control government are regarded as anti-democratic. I started by saying that the late 20th century saw an enormous expansion of judicial review. I should have taken a glass of water, but I don't have it available. I'm sorry for that. Now, many constitutional courts are under political pressure. Bruce Ackerman, a very famous colleague of Roberto Barroso and myself at Yale Law School, in his most recent book on constitutionalism, which was already written in the view of emerging populism, said, in countries with constitutional courts, in countries with judicial review, it will take years until a system transformation into an authoritarian system is successful, because the court will stand in its way. But what if the transformation of the system starts with eliminating the courts? And this is what we see happen in a number of countries, where populist parties or leaders won an election and constitutional courts were their first targets. They were either paralyzed by legislation or were brought on government lines by replacing oppositional judges to judges of the government party. In Hungary and Poland, after all, two member states of the European Union, where democracy is a condition for being a member of the European Union, a few months were enough to paralyze constitutional courts. And these two countries are not the only examples. Popular parties or leaders thus immunize themselves against criticism and against alternative concepts. And they use legal means to perpetuate their rule, election laws, media laws, etc. The purpose is to make it difficult for the opposition to win an election. Should it happen, they have entrenched so much of their own party program that even a successful opposition will have only little space for reforms. Hungary, for this purpose, created a totally new type of laws that can be enacted with a simple majority, but can change only with a supermajority. All this, and these are only examples, there are more means, all this is the opposite of constitutionalism as we know it, which I regard as one of the biggest civilizing achievements of the world in the last 200 years. But here, constitutions are turned from their function as a shared basis of otherwise diverging opinions into a weapon of the majority against the minority. The form of the constitution is preserved, the substance is abandoned. And therefore, it is an important question whether democratic constitutionalism can prevent populist movements from taking over a country, and whether democratic constitutions can protect themselves against abolition or against a deprivation of their true function. My own country, Germany, made a few attempts in this direction after having experienced the self-destruction of a liberal democracy, the Weimar Republic, in the 1930s, and the transformation into a totalitarian system, the Nazi system, which denied any bonds to legal power. The means that were taken after the end of the Nazi dictatorship are known under the name of militant democracy, meaning that those who set out to destroy the democratic order and replace it by an authoritarian one may be eliminated from the democratic process. Parties that have this aim can be banned, associations that aim to destroy democracy can be banned, and this has frequently been copied by more recent constitutions. But we have seen that the populism of our days is not the same as the anti-democratic movements of the 20th century. The populists of today very often sail below this threshold, and they reveal their true motives only after having come to power. And in addition, as long as a political party, populist party, is small, it may look disproportionate to ban it. If it has become strong, it may be too late to ban it. Other means that Germany adopted after the Nazi regime are that the fundamental principles of the constitutional order are exempt from amendment. This is the so-called eternity clause of the German constitution, also frequently copied by other countries later on. But of course, such an eternity clause is valid only as long as the constitution that contains it exists. If a populist party gains a majority sufficient to make a new constitution, it can of course sideline the eternity clause. And this brings me to the importance of the electoral system. Again, the European examples of Poland and Hungary are illustrative. In Poland, the populist party called PiS obtained 36% of the votes in a free election. But because of the electoral system, these 36% of votes translated into an absolute majority of mandates. Hungary even more so. In Hungary, the Populist Party gained 53% of the votes, but they translated in a 2/3 majority. The same exists in other democratic systems, which have not yet been the victim of populist parties. And they justify this electoral system by the idea of giving stability to government. But the tacit assumption was, of course, that only democratic parties will compete. And if anti-democratic parties compete, it helps them to establish their rule as a permanent rule. Poland and Hungary are illustrative still in another sense. If a populist party in a free election obtains a 2/3 majority, that's to say the majority that is necessary to amend the constitution or make a new constitution, then everything that constitutions can help is lost. They then can entrench their party program on constitutional level, and they can make changes extremely difficult. And that happened in Hungary. After having tamed the constitutional court, the populist party with its 2/3 majority wrote a new constitution. All propositions of the opposition were voted down without even a discussion, so that the current Hungarian constitution is, so to say, the party program of the party adopted on constitutional level. Poland, where the populist party only had an absolute majority, not a 2/3 majority, did not have the possibility to amend the constitution or to adopt a new constitution. And this shows the extreme importance of an entrenchment of the rules of the game of a democracy, of the essentials of liberal constitutionalism on constitutional level. I think it is particularly important to entrench the electoral system on constitutional level. By the way, it's not the case in Germany. The election law is a law, an ordinary law, that's to say can be altered by a normal, a simple majority. However, the Polish example, where the party does not have a 2/3 majority, shows that the constitution is not an absolute guarantee even in this case. The populist party in Poland didn't shy away from massive violations of the constitution. And under these circumstances, nothing depends on the constitution, but everything depends on whether the society tolerates these violations or protests against them. This experience, by the way, reminds me of the time 30 years ago, time after the many changes in the world in 1989, when many new constitutional courts were established, as I said. I was a member at that time of the German Constitutional Court, and I remember well that very many of these newly established constitutional courts traveled to Karlsruhe. Karlsruhe is the city in Germany where the Constitutional Court sits, not in Berlin, not in the capital. And so delegation after delegation came. The Russian Constitutional Court came 3 times to Karlsruhe. The South African Constitutional Court met for the first time, not in Johannesburg, but in Karlsruhe, and discussed with us for a full week what constitutional adjudication means. Now, I remember quite well, and I will end with this, that one question was asked by every delegation that came. And the question was, how does one manage that political leaders obey the constitution and obey the rulings of the Constitutional Court, even if they contradict their own interest and disturb their plans? And I also remember that a colleague of mine said the answer is easy. In the statute of the Constitutional Court, there is a paragraph saying rulings of the Constitutional Court are binding for all other state agencies. But this, of course, was not the answer that was helpful for these countries. There is no legal answer to this question. The answer is outside the law. We enter the realm of cultural preconditions of democracy and constitutionalism. Much depends on whether there is an understanding in a society, whether the rule of law is a value in itself. whether an open discourse in a society is an advantage for that society. It makes a difference whether people have trust in constitutional courts or other apex courts. And all that is not sure. It takes a very long time to build these cultural preconditions of liberal democracy and constitutional adjudication, but they can be lost in a very short time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now it's your turn, Justice Barroso.
So here I go. First of all, I want to thank the German Embassy and Instituto Fernando Henrique Cardoso for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Michael Westland, with Sergio Fausto, and with my good and old friend, Dieter Grimm. Dieter is one of the finest constitutional scholars I have met in my long career. We meet every year in a meeting at Yale called Global Constitutionalism Seminar. He was in Rio last year for a very interesting event, and it's really a pleasure, Dieter, to be able to listen to you again, and we are soon going to meet once again. So this subject that brings us here is the one that has been discussed the most, I would say, in the past few years. And I want to share some of my views, which are very close to what Dieter has exposed so far. So I don't have any relevant disagreement. I'm just maybe going to see things from a different perspectives, at least in some of the issues. So constitutional democracy was the winning ideology, the victorious ideology of the 20th century, having defeated all alternative projects that appeared over time: communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. At the turn of the 20th century to the 21st century, according to the Freedom House, 119 countries held free elections with universal suffrage. That even led Francis Fukuyama to write first his famous article and then the book talking about the end of history and celebrating that liberal democracy based on the rule of law, free market, individual freedoms, and the right of political participation was the culmination of the ideological evolution of humanity. So the first point we want to make clear here is that constitutional democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century after having disputed supremacy with many other alternatives that appeared. Lately, however, as has been noticed by Michael Westland and by Dieter Grimm, something seems to be going wrong. A illiberal wave has swept the world, promoting what some authors have called a democratic recession or a democratic retrogression. And examples have been accumulating over the years. Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Philippines, Nicaragua, Venezuela. The novelty that has been pointed out by all the previous speakers is that the recent erosion of democracy is not attributable to the weapons of military leaders, but to the leadership of presidents and prime ministers that have been elected by popular vote. And gradually, as has been noted, brick by brick, the deconstruction of democracy after the elections starts its way with concentration of powers in the executive, curtailment of freedom of expression, persecution of opposition leaders, approval of new constitutions or constitutional amendments with abuse of power by the majorities, and packing the Supreme Courts or the constitutional courts with submissive judges. So after stating that democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century, what I am pointing out here is that in this first quarter of the 21st century, something does not seem to be going well. So I will try to identify some of the reasons why I am making this statement, or I am reinforcing this conclusion that something is not going well. Under my view, Sergio, Dieter, and Michael, there are three different phenomena occurring simultaneously. They're different, but they are contemporary. The first phenomenon is populism. The second is radical conservatism. And the third is authoritarianism. They are confused, although they're different things. They're not confused, but when they come together, that's when the trouble starts. Populism, the first one I mentioned, is when charismatic leaders manipulate the needs and the fear of the population, promising immediate solutions that often take a heavy toll in the future. The most common strategies of populism or of modern populism are, first, the use of social media, establishing direct communication with people. And our friend Dieter Issacharoff has written a very interesting piece on this facet of populism, this way of direct communication with the masses through social media. The second strategy, I would say, of populism is the bypass of the institutional intermediary institutions, I want to say, that mediate this contact with the people. So in a democracy, you have intermediary institutions, and what populists usually do is try to bypass these institutions, such as legislatures, such as the press, such as civil society entities. So this is the second strategy. The first is direct communication. The second is bypassing institutions. And the third one is attacks on the watchdogs, attacks on the institutions that are there to a certain extension, control the exercise of power, like, for example, the Supreme Court or the constitutional courts. I think these are main features of modern populism. The second phenomenon I mentioned that is a feature of these days is radical conservatism. There is nothing wrong, I'm going to say at the outset, about being conservative. It's one of the legitimate options in the political spectrum. The problem lies in intolerant and aggressive behavior, which usually seeks to deny or withdraw rights from those who think differently. So intolerance is the feature of this radical conservatism that we see these days. And the third phenomenon of our times is authoritarianism in Latin America and in Central and Eastern Europe. An authoritarian past always haunts democratic institutions, offering permanent temptation to those who come to power. So, Sergio, Dieter, and Michael, this is one important point I would like to make, trying to identify some of the elements that are present in this juncture of democratic erosion: populism, radical conservatism, and authoritarianism. They are different things, but when they come together, that's when the democratic erosion occurs, or what my friend and Dieter's Chappelle has called autocratic legalism, Kim Chappelle, autocratic legalism. So in the next chapter of my presentation, of my talk, I tried to identify, Sergio and Dieter and Michael, some of the main causes of this conservative authoritarian populism that characterizes the political scenario of the world today. And I came to 3 causes. I have this obsession for classifying everything in 3 categories, and it has followed me. It's like a superstition, Michael, but it works. I like to remember one passage I read once, that a Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize winner, he had by the door of his office a horseshoe. And one day, a journalist asks him why him, a scientist and agnostic, why would he have a horseshoe by his office? And he said, well, I heard that it brings good luck, even for those who don't believe in it. So, I am a militant of this creed. So the 3 causes I would identify, Sergio, in these current days for this authoritarian populism are the following. In the first place, there are political causes. And among the political causes, I would point out the first one, the crisis of representativeness of legislatures. The current political process and electoral systems do not give voice and relevance to citizenship. They don't represent us. That's the motto of many of the public events we've heard about. The second political cause is that in many parts of the world, corruption undermines the credibility of the political class, paving the way for candidates that present themselves as anti-establishment candidates, or candidates, quote, against everything that's out there. And I would say the third political cause is the feeling that it's the globalized economic financial power that's truly calling the shots. And that at the end of the day, local or national politics play a fairly small role in this world game that we are all involved into. So these are the three political causes, I would say, Sergio. Crisis of representativeness, the corruption undermining the political class, and the feeling that it's not the local politics that really call the shots. In the second place, I try to identify what I call the social and economic causes. And then here we have three again. The first one is that in some parts of the world, like in Brazil, for example, unemployment due to a prolonged recession is a main cause for the support of these outsider populists that present themselves as anti-establishment. The second social and economic causes is that in other parts of the world, the problem is not unemployment, but it's the lack of prospects for social ascent, social progression in a world dominated by globalization and technology, leaving behind traditional activities, people that just cannot adapt to this new economy. And the third social and economic cause that I think we could all agree is the immense inequality that still stigmatizes and haunts the contemporary world despite all the progress. Democratic constitutionalism, which is, with its many virtues, has not yet been able to defeat extreme poverty and unfair inequality throughout the world. And the third category of causes I have identified are what I call cultural identity causes. And this one, it's usually not pointed out by authors more generally. So what are these cultural identity causes? I would say there is a relevant contingent of people who do not profess the cosmopolitan, egalitarian, and multicultural creed that drives the progressive agenda. Secondly, identifying some of the items of this agenda, it includes human rights, racial equality, feminist politics, gay marriage, defense of indigenous people, environmental protection, drug decriminalization, among other modern social movements. So there is a progressive agenda that has been victorious in the past decades. This agenda includes these items I just mentioned, and many people that felt defeated but not convinced, they cling to traditional values that offer security and a nostalgic dream of recovering from lost hegemony. So this is the third set of causes, the cultural identity causes. The progressive agenda prevailed in the past decades in the world, I would say, but many people we won, but we didn't convince them. We didn't bring them together. And so part of this radical conservative reaction comes from people that felt excluded and were not convinced by our progressive values. I would like to end this part of my participation saying a few words about the Brazilian democracy, and I call this chapter the resilience of the Brazilian democracy. And here, this is an academic event, so I'll speak a bit more freely than I speak publicly. Although frequently attacked, so I'm going to say some aspects that motivate me to say that the Brazilian democracy has been quite resilient. First, although frequently attacked by the president himself, the Brazilian press is plural, independent, and harshly critical of the government. Of this one, should I add, and of all the previous one. So one thing that I think contributes to this resilience of the Brazilian democracy is a free, independent, and fairly powerful press that we have in Brazil. The second factor I would add to my analysis of the resilience of the Brazilian democracy is that in the face of authoritarian rhetorical manifestations by the president or by people close to him, including invoking the times of the dictatorship, civil society reacted vigorously, condemning the attacks on institutions and leading the authors of such attacks to take them back. So the reaction of the Brazilian society to what it perceived as threats, although they were just rhetorical threats, the reaction was very vigorous. And I think that showed the resilience of Brazilian democracy. Parties from the left to the right, the press, the universities, civil society, the reaction was prompt and very effective, to the point that they had to take what they had said back. A third factor is that an independent Supreme Court restrained the president's power, defending federalism during the pandemic, important decisions, preserving federalism, the power of the states and of the local governments, fundamental rights, freedom of expression, indigenous rights, and the court seeks to contain threats that are made to people and to institutions from this hierarchical, concerted, and funded groups that disseminate the so-called fake news or hate speech or disinformation campaigns, which is a true danger for democracy all over the world. This digital militias that practice moral terrorism against opponents. So the reaction that democracy has been able to present to all attacks or to all moves that were felt as threats, I think clearly show the resilience of the democratic system in Brazil. It's not that we should not be alert, but I think we are crossing these tough times, preserving the integrity of the main elements of democracy. And as a conclusion, Brazilian constitutional democracy completes 32 years this year of 2020. This is an achievement that should not be taken for granted in a country like Brazil and in a continent like Latin America. And let me add, these were not trivial times, Dieter. We went through the impeachment of 2 presidents elected by popular vote. We had times of hyperinflation, we had recession, we had extremely high unemployment, we had dramatic corruption scandals, we had center, left, and right-wing governments, and a president who defends the dictatorship and exalts torture, amid other vicissitudes. And no one has ever considered a solution other than respect for constitutional legality. That's something new in Brazilian history. That's something we really should celebrate. So Sergio, Dieter, Michael, if I had to write a book today about Brazil, it could easily be called How Democracies Survive. I just hope it's not an illusion, like the guy who fell off the 20th floor of a building, and when passing the 15th floor, he thought, so far, so good. Thank you very much.
Very good, very good. Michael, who goes first? I can ask the first question.
Yeah, just go ahead with the first question.
All right. And wonderful. It was really a delight to listen to both of you. I would like to focus on the role of social media, because I think it's fair to say that before conquering power and distorting liberal institutions, populist movements conquer social media. Social media has proved to be a propitious tool for the rise of populist and movements and leaders. I know that Germany in particular has adopted very stringent laws with the aim of regulating social media. Critics say that it encroaches on freedom of expression. And I would like to hear Professor Dieter Grimm's assessment of the regulation of the social media in Germany. The law adopted a few years ago, as far as I know, there is currently an attempt to make it even more severe than it was. So I would like your assessment on whether this is the right way to go, and whether the criticism that it encroaches on freedom of expression is a fair criticism. And if Justice Barroso, feel free to comment on that, because here we are also adopting a law with the aim of regulating and combating fake news. It's a very controversial law. I would understand if you refrain from commenting that, because it might land on your table at the Supreme Court. But anyway, feel free to choose whether to comment or not. These are my first question. This is my first question.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say that the social media are, of course, ambiguous. There is use of the social media, political use of the social media, which we would reject. And there is also use of the social media, which we would probably welcome. I think the Arab Spring that we had a number of years ago, which failed ultimately, would never have happened without social media. I think what is now going on in a country like Belarus would not be possible without social media. So they can help democratic movements. They can also be used for anti-democratic movements. And I think this has to be taken into account when one undertakes to regulate them. Now, German regulation is now to a large extent, meanwhile, European regulation. The European Union has intervened, and a lot of social media regulation is now European law, which can then be concretized and elaborated by the member states. The attempt the attempt is that false statements of fact that hurt someone else can be suppressed. So the media enterprises are under an obligation to investigate whether there are false informations, and everybody who may be affected by false informations has a right to claim that these are abolished. This is also what the European Court decided, even in a case where there was true information about a person, but affecting his personal life. Now, there's one problem in my view, namely the problem that in order to avoid difficulties, the media enterprises may suppress more information than deserves being suppressed because they avoid trouble. They say there is someone who complains, we eliminate it, but it may be a useful information for society. The German Constitutional Court recently rendered a judgment that slightly tries to correct the European Court's approach that a complaint suffices, but that also the interest of the general public in the availability of that information is used. But I think we are still in a situation where we are trying out this or that. We haven't found our final resolution for this problem that you rightly describe.
Justice Barroso. All right.
I can say a few things. One of the bad things of being a justice is that I can think anything I want, but I can't say everything I would like to. As Dieter is not a justice anymore, so actually he has more freedom than I do. What I would say about social media, about the internet, this third revolution, third industrial revolution, which is the technological revolution, and we are entering the fourth revolution, as that we all know. It totally changed the world, the way we live, the way we communicate, the way we do a research, the way we listen to music. So we cannot deny the impact, and I would say the positive impact of the technological revolution. We even have a new vocabulary. I was trying to write down a few words, Sergio, that until the other day, we didn't know. They didn't exist, and now they identify utilities and modernities that we wouldn't be able to live without. Check some of them. Google, WhatsApp, Uber, Dropbox, Skype, Facebook, Telegram, which in Brazil became quite dangerous, as you know, Twitter, Instagram, Waze, Spotify, Amazon, Netflix, and YouTube. And for those who are single, there's also Tinder. So just check all the novelties that we have in this brave new world we are living. So I am not one of those skeptics that think that the technological revolution is a disaster. I think it brought a lot of good things, positive things that we should note. However, with the internet and with the social media came, we had expected at once as a German major philosopher, countryman of Dieter Habermas, once thought we could have a major public sphere for a public debate where people would present reasons seeking the best argument and the best solution. So some people might have dreamed that the internet would become such a public sphere. To a certain extent, it did. But of course, there have been problems in this process, and the internet is also the stage for hate speeches, for misinformation campaigns, for this cult of lies that you see. And all of a sudden, everyone is believing something that's totally absurd. I was noting, Sergio, that there was this one man, because the people, some of the people that act in the social media, they're just criminals. Some other ones are psychopaths, and some of them accumulate. It's really problematic in many parts of the world. So, Dieter, you wouldn't believe this, but there was this person that invented this theory that myself, another justice, Alexandre de Moraes, one lawyer from Brasilia, the embassy of North Korea and of China, we were spying President Bolsonaro and preparing a coup d'etat. And millions of people watched this. And all of a sudden, you have to deny things that are really ridiculous. Yep. So there is one good thing before I end, and I say one word about the law, the bill you wanted, is that the social media, Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook and Google, at first they had a position that I don't interfere with anything. I don't want to be a private censor. I don't care what people are doing or what they're saying. I'm just the media. They've had a change of heart, and they have been very cooperative with the electoral justice at this moment, trying to track this, what they call inauthentic behaviors in the internet, which is very important. About the bill, I won't be able to talk about details, but I think the concept is right in the sense that they do not go after the contents, Richard. There's no interference with what is being said. The law tries to monitor behaviors and not content. So I think, without going into details, that this premise is valid and it's good. And it's what I'm doing here at the Electoral Court. I have partnerships with all major social medias, not to monitor the content, but to have them monitor the behavior of robots, of bots, of fake profiles, and the dissemination of objective lies. They have been very cooperative in this sense. So the monitoring of behaviors, improper behaviors and not content, I think it's a good premise and a good philosophy of this bill that's being discussed.
Thank you. Michael, your turn.
Yeah, one question which leads on from that question on social media is the role of political parties in an age of social media, where we see that political parties seem not to be needed anymore for certain politicians in some countries, because they can, what you also mentioned before, they can appeal directly to the people and build up their own support. Now, constitutional law, and especially party law in Germany, but also here in Brazil, with this elaborate structure of the TSE, of our Parteiengesetz, is basically based upon the idea of there being parties as intermediaries. Do we have to change constitutional law also to make room for this new world of lacking intermediaries, so to speak? Perhaps first Professor Grimm and then Minister Barroso.
For me, it is extremely difficult to conceive of a representative democracy without political parties, because there is a need to form out of the millions of different opinions and interests some alternatives that can then be presented for election, for vote to the society. So it's very difficult for me to see what could replace it. Of course, we could imagine nowadays that every political question that is at stake can be answered by everybody by pushing a button, but without any discussion going, without any presenting of alternatives that come by political parties. I think this is an illusion. On the other hand, I see what you mentioned, that political parties lose support, they lose membership. The membership of the major German parties is half of what it was 20 years ago. And this is a continuing trend. So that my idea would be that we have to admit additional ways, additional channels from the society to government, that the monopoly that political parties had for us, never a full monopoly, there were unions, there were churches and other institutions, but this quasi-monopoly that political parties had to lead interests and ideas into the governmental sphere must be opened for other channels. And I would find this helpful, but one has to see that this will not be a full solution. What I will also observe is that people's movements that try these channels of direct influence very often are one-issue movements. They are against, let's take a German example, the new main station in Stuttgart 21, a big project. They are in favor of saving all refugees. So they are very often a single issue movements. That's to say, they pursue one goal without taking into account the interconnectedness of very many political fields. And this is why I think I don't speak against these movements. They are totally legitimate, but they cannot replace political parties and they cannot replace the representative system. So I think open it up and have a positive attitude toward the other channels that are available. But it's difficult again for me to say that we could waive political parties, but keep a representative democracy.
Thank you very much, Minister Barroso. Would you have something to add from the Brazilian perspective with these very many parties and the tendency of politicians to switch between parties, but then very strong legislative grounds on the other hand?
Well, I of course, I think that there is a problem with credibility with the political parties, and that's not a Brazilian phenomenon. I think that can be found all over the world. One thing I want to say is polarization, Michael, has always existed in different views of the same problems. The American founding fathers, they thought they could fight what they call factionism, the power of factions. But truly, in the first succession in the US, the George Washington successions, you already had the John Adams with the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson with the Republicans. So the division in different views, the polarization is, I think I could say, it's a indelible characteristic of democracy. And then in the French National Assembly, from the outset, you had left and right. Our generations went through the dispute between socialism and planned economies and capitalism and free market. So I think there will be always different strands of political views in the world. And it's just inevitable that this be canalized to political parties unless we invent something different, what until now has not been thought of. So I don't think we can have democracies without political parties. What I think democracy will need in the near future is seek new institutional designs. Like, for example, the separation of powers that we have in the world that's a institutional perspective that was conceived to a world pre-industrial revolution, I think we could say. And of course, we need to rethink, I think, separation of powers. Fundamental rights were thought initially as individual rights, protection against the state. And this has evolved to different categories of rights that include three main categories: the individual rights, political rights, and social rights. And there are new demands coming up. There's just a new book that just came out called The Coming Good Society by Sushma Raman from the Kennedy School, discussing the appearance of new rights that we had never thought of. So I think we live in a changing world, changing very quickly, and we might need to think new structures, new institutional designs to accommodate these new demands. What I can say, Michael, for sure, is that there is a generalized dissatisfaction with the institutions. One of the problems with contemporary democracy is people are not satisfied with what they're getting. And of course, if you're not satisfied with what you're getting, there's always the risk that you're going to seek for something different. And people like us who think democracies are the best way of governing a country, especially those like myself and some of you that have gone through dictatorships. We know that, we know better. But I think we need to think new ways of attracting young people to our creed, because there is a lot of skepticism, a lot of pessimism regarding democracy. And I think extreme poverty and inequality and corruption are three malfunctions, I would say, that decrease the appeal of democracy. So I think, among other things, that extreme poverty, unfair inequality. I like to say unfair inequality, because of course, if a major soccer player makes millions, or if a famous author sells millions of books, that increases inequality, but that's not what we are fighting against, not against talent or hard work. But there's a lot of unfair inequality that we must fight. So I think democracy should have in the top of its agenda facing the extreme poverty throughout the world and within countries, tackling unfair inequalities, and improving the mechanisms that, especially in countries like Brazil, naturalized wrong things that we can generally denominate corruption.
All right, now my turn. I have two questions here from the public, which are somewhat related. One was asked by Guilherme Santander and the other by Maristela Santana. And I'll try to sum them up. And it has to do, the question is the following. Based on empirical observations and your reflections on the subject, can we establish a correlation between certain features, institutional features of political systems and vulnerability to populist movements? For instance, parliamentary systems vis-a-vis presidential systems, majoritarian electoral systems vis-a-vis proportional and so on and so forth. And particularly in the case of Brazil, Minister Barroso, which is, well, a multi-party system, a federal a federal system with lots of veto powers and checks and balances. How vulnerable do you think we are to that kind of phenomenon? Or on looking from another point of view, how resilient we are given the features of our institutional arrangement to this sort of phenomenon?
Should I start?
You can start, and then Dieter follows.
Okay, I feel more comfortable when I follow Dieter than. It's okay. Well, Guilherme and Maristela, I think the Brazilian, when we talk about the political system, I think we're talking about three different things: the system of government, presidential or parliamentarian. We are talking about the electoral system, majoritarian or proportional, and we are talking about the party system, the way you create parties and how they function. I think we have problems in the three levels of the political system. I think there is one major problem in the system of government that we usually take for granted. And I've been writing on this, Sergio, to my credit, since 2006, saying we need to take advantage of these calm times, not anymore, that's when I wrote, these calm times, to improve our system of government. Hyper-presidentialism has always been a mill of crisis in Latin America and in Brazil, and a risk for fragile democracies or authoritarian democracies. So to reduce the hyper-presidentialism to a model in which you have a president, an elected president, because of course in Brazil, it would be unthinkable not to have direct elections for president, but the president should be a head of state with few very important competences, like having maintaining international relations, appointing the superior court judges, appointing the military commanders. He can present bills to parliament, and he appoints the prime minister. But the head of government in the day-to-day struggle of politics, what I call in Portuguese, varejo da política, that should not be an affair for the president. It should be an affair for a prime minister whose permanence in office depends on political support from Congress. And if he lacks this support, you can change the prime minister through a mistrust or vote, but you don't affect the stability of the system, because the guarantor of the stability is the president, and he has a fixed mandate. So I have been defending this model to reduce the power of the president to important but state competences, and have a political agent, if I can use this expression, in the struggle of everyday politics. I wrote this in 2006, and it would have avoided at least the impeachment of President Rousseff, who I am very convinced that was impeached, not for corruption, but for lack of political support in Congress and even in society. And the second problem, I don't want to be too long, is the electoral system. I am a fan of the German system of elections for the legislature, this mixed system that kind of, it's proportional in the end of the day, but it's kind of majoritarian and proportional. I've written about this. The Electoral Court has an official proposal presented to Congress defending this model, except the possibility of changing the number of members of parliament. We didn't consider this possibility. because it would be unworkable here, Dieter. But I am a strong supporter, as former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso also were, of this, in Portuguese, we call a mixed district system, which I think would make elections less expensive, because the cost of elections is behind most of the problems we've had with corruption, as you certainly know. And it's a much more representative system in the sense that the citizen will know who is his representative in the legislature. Because in the system we have right now, which is an open list proportional system, you vote in whoever you want, but you elect who you don't know, because as you all know, you vote in your candidate, but the vote goes to the party, and the most voted of that party gets the chair, gets the seat. But according to past elections, Sergio, only 5% of the deputies were elected with their own votes. 95% were elected transferring votes that were given to other deputies. So at the end of the day, the citizen, the voter, he doesn't know who represents him. And the candidate does not know who elected him. So there's no accountability. It's a horrible system. And I think we need to change it. And I want to push this agenda. The president of the Chamber of Deputies, when we presented this proposal last year, I wasn't the president here yet, he said he would bring that to discussion in the floor. But what happened is that with the pandemic, everything was kind of postponed. But I think we need to push this agenda, because with this lack of representativeness of the political system, we're always going to have problems.
I think our German experiences with our electoral system are basically very satisfactory, with one problem that you briefly mentioned, but we won't discuss that. I only suggest that we talk about that in person, because if you should adopt something like the German system, you should avoid this problem. Problem is that there is no ceiling. Yeah, the parliament can grow and grow. But the question that was asked from the audience, I find it extremely interesting. Are there institutional arrangements that are more prone to populism than others? And I must confess that I haven't thought much about this question. And in this few moments when I thought about them, I was unable to find some direct link between either presidential or parliamentary system, etc., and the populism. But I think I can give one very general answer. And the general answer is, the more accumulated power you have in one institution of the many institutions of the system, the more prone is the system for populism, because if you get that institution, you have almost all. So I think one interesting remark might be that a federal system, a truly federal system like the United States, like the German one, I don't know exactly about the Brazilian, but I know that it is a federal system, that a federal system is sort of a barrier against a full takeover of a populist movement or a populist party. There is not only horizontal separation of powers, but the federal system also has a vertical separation of powers, which makes it more difficult, because there are many more instances, institutions, channels that you have to gain in order to fully prevail with the populist program. So this is the answer, but the question is worth to think more about it. Probably the answer is less in the institutions than more in the cultural backgrounds, but I'll reflect about that. Thank you for the question.
Michael, your turn.
Yeah. I got one question that hinges on the connection between liberal democracy and the nation, because you, Professor Grimm, said that what distinguishes populists from others is that populists have that notion of a pre-existing people. But then, on the other hand, the nation, or this imagined community in Benedict Anderson's terms, is also something that especially in Europe, we are trying to struggle to get over with, on the one hand, because we see that there are problems bigger, or problems that the nation cannot solve, but then political allegiances seem to be bound up with the nation. How then to square this sort of problem? On the one hand, that you said you need a pluralist political system which doesn't base itself on pre-existing communities, but then having the nation as such a strong player. That's the question for you. And for Minister Barroso, this question whether there's a different conception of the people or the nation in Brazil today compared to the past, given that nationalism seems to be on the rise here as well. But of course, there are different undertones here than in Europe and the European nation term.
I think...
Professor Grimm?
Yeah, I think that I can reconcile these two positions. In order to live in a democracy, in a common democratic state, I think on the one hand, there is a necessity of a number of shared values or shared basic assumptions that belong to all groups that otherwise may have very different opinions and interests. There has to be, in the first place, a feeling of belonging of a country. Belonging is the basis of a certain solidarity. Solidarity requires that I regard the others as somehow, in some way or other, close to me or closer than others. So below these general level of a general feeling of belonging and a general assumption of values, I can tolerate a lot of different opinions and interests. And I can find a peaceful way of negotiating these different opinions and interests, which would not be the case if I assume that there is already a pre-existing notion of the public best. And if someone diverges from this, he can only be an enemy of the people or has to be eliminated. So I think if we distinguish these two levels, the general level feeling of belonging, solidarity, from the level of different opinions and interests on concrete measures or general directions of how politics should go, we could reconcile the both.
Okay. Minister Barroso?
Michael, that's a tough question. It might take, it could take another hour and a half for me to give you a decent answer to that. I have strong views on that. And I think what Dieter just said is the basic fabric, the sense of belonging. Democracy is a project of self-government that has to bring everyone along. If you feel excluded, you just don't adhere to it. And we have a lot of exclusion in Brazil. We have exclusion due to poverty. We have exclusion due to racism. And I think one good thing that's fairly new in Brazil is social conscience, is the perception that we have these problems. Because traditionally, we would hide these problems by saying that we are morally superior. There's no racism here. It was the discourse of the Brazilian racial humanism. It was a lie. And these days, as we all know, there is a much bigger conscience that this is a problem. Yesterday, as you might have read, we took a very important decision here, Greta, at the Electoral Court, saying that the public funds that go to the candidates have to respect the proportion of Afro-Brazilian candidates. So if you have 30% of Black candidates, 30% of the funds are attached to such candidates. And although this might sound obvious, you wouldn't believe how much people felt uncomfortable with that and how much pressure there was against that change. And it was even postponed for next elections. It won't start this year. But just to show that institutions are starting to act according to a new social conscience, which I think it's a novelty in Brazil. The commitment we have to fight poverty, to fight inequality, and to fight racism. I would say a nation, the one I would like to help build, would need. And these elements, three again, they hold people together. First, integrity, which is the fabric for trust. So integrity for me is the first chapter of the building of a nation, because trust depends on that. And integrity for me has two basic rules. In the public life, you don't deviate money. In the public life, you don't try to take undue advantage over anyone. It might sound very simple, but I think it's very revolutionary in Brazil. The second element that I think will bring people together is this commitment to social justice, to fighting poverty and inequality, because justice is also a prime demand of any civilized person. And in the third place, I would list progress, because well-being, the sense that you are improving your lives, is very important to gather support for democracy. So I think a nation needs integrity because that brings trust. A nation needs social justice because justice is a natural demand of a civilized person. And we need progress because people need the sense that they're moving forward and that they are improving their lives and their well-being. I think these are three factors that really help building a nation and bringing people together over some values that can unite all of us despite different political views.
Sergio, would you have another question? We've reached the end of our time, but I think we can do one more question if you've got one.
Yeah, I saved the more provocative one to the final part of our conversation, and it sort of taps on a question asked by Alexandre Ribeiro Filho, and I will sort of rephrase his question, but try to keep its spirit intact, and it's the following. Can constitutional courts sort of fan the flames of social conservatism when the critics would say they usurp the powers of the legislative branch of government and push forward items of the progressive agenda that does
constitutional scholars with an ability that is remarkable, especially for a German scholar. He writes about complex things in a very easy way to understand, which is really notable. And as Dieter has written, and all constitutional scholars would agree, the Supreme Courts or constitutional courts have two main roles: to protect democracy and to protect fundamental rights. And the protection of fundamental rights can be, it's not always, but can be sometimes counter-majoritarian. That's why I've written and I say it was recently published in the American Journal of Comparative Law, my piece on that, that courts sometimes need to play an enlightened role to push history forward. So when you're playing your role as someone that needs to protect fundamental rights, sometimes you need to have this progressive agenda, because the progress of humankind is defeating prejudices, is defeating established conventional wisdom. It's been conventional wisdom that women were inferior. It's been conventional wisdom that blacks were inferiors. It's been conventional wisdom that gays should not have any rights. And of course, to defeat obsolete conventional wisdom, you need sometimes to face the majoritarian view. So protecting fundamental rights might mean sometimes being truly counter-majoritarian, like the US Supreme Court was when they voted Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. That was not a majoritarian view, at least not in the southern states for sure. But you could not expect a major change like that against racism to come from Congress or to come from state legislatures. It would either be the Supreme Court or no one would do it. And you would have an institutionalized racism in the United States until today. When the Israeli Supreme Court said, we do not tolerate torture, not even against, quote, terrorists, unquote, that was against the majority of the population and even the Knesset. But of course, that was an enlightened decision. You cannot torture people. When the South African Constitutional Court decided for the unconstitutionality of the death penalty that victimized mostly Black people, it was probably against the majority. And when I was the lawyer, as you might know, when we brought to the Supreme Court the civil union for gay people case, that was unacceptable. When we filed the lawsuit in probably 2008, that was unthinkable. When it was finally decided in 2011, it was a unanimous vote. So sometimes, in special times, you don't, if you are a Supreme Court justice or a judge, you should not act like a politician, and you should not think you are a representative of the people. You represent the Constitution. But there are fundamental rights that need an active court to be protected and to be promoted. So when this happens, is it a progressive agenda? Of course. But if we didn't have the courts leading a progressive agenda to protect fundamental rights, it's not to protect my values, it's to protect fundamental values. If you don't have a court to defend Blacks, to defend gays, to defend women, if you depend on the majority, you won't have any progress. So of course, sometimes the court needs to be progressive. I feel very comfortable with this role. It's a tough role, including the abortion discussion, which is much more complex, and you have important decisions from the German court. So I think it's part of my role to bring these issues forward. And although I get a lot of criticism for it, I feel proud for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know this criticism as well. It seems to be everywhere where you have a strong constitutional court or Supreme Court with constitutional adjudication. But I think there is no general answer to that question. A constitutional court or judicial review in general is not per se progressive or conservative. But you can say about one court that it is progressive and one that it's more conservative. Or you can even say that of one court at a certain period of time, it was ahead of the feelings and interests of society, and sometimes it was back behind the interest. What is the mission of a constitutional court and a general court with constitutional adjudication is, of course, to enforce the constitution against the political majority. This is the business of a court. If the majority transgresses the bonds of the constitution, that has to be said regardless of whether it is regarded as progressive or conservative. So the main question is, do you find a sound way, a rational way to argue the result, deriving it from the norms of the constitution? This is the difficulty, I think. The democratic problem of constitutional review is not that the court can decide against the majority, but the democratic problem is that the norms of the constitution are often very imprecise and vague, so that the standard that you apply is made in the process of application to a certain extent. It's not a purely cognitive endeavor, but it's at the same time also a creative endeavor. I think this is the democratic problem, not what the Americans always see, the counter-majoritarian difficulty. The court is there in order to enforce the limits that are drawn by the constitution to majorities.
All right, so as we are now even a quarter of an hour beyond the time that we wanted to finish, let me please thank you, the two speakers, very much for these very insightful and important views that you shared with the audience. Thanks very much for joining us in this format. And of course, Sergio as well as co-moderator and the FHC.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Peter, it was great to see you.
Bye-bye, Roberto.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
It was a learning experience.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Stay safe.